All right, cool. So yeah, this is your first lecture on React. By the way, I'm Sean, because if that wasn't clear yet to anybody. Cool, so you guys just had your HTML, CSS stuff, if I believe. I believe. And so I think, the idea there for that particular material and that particular curriculum was that everyone comments on the Christmas lights. Was that you worked with like raw HTML and CSS to kind of build some sort of static page, right? And I guess kind of the idea or kind of the motivation for that particular project and why we put that kind of there in the curriculum was so, you work with raw HTML and CSS and kind of, are in the weeds of that, and to kind of give you an idea that working with raw HTML and CSS is not very efficient. It's not actually really done or fun. Yeah, I'm not gonna, sure. Probably not very fun, not particularly efficient. And so now React, we're basically going to be going into teaching you guys about a front-end framework. So React is just one example of a front-end framework. There are many others. Angular is another popular one. There are a bunch out there. I don't actually really have much of a list, but just trust me when I say there's a bunch out there. Each of them kind of do it differently, but the general idea of what a front-end framework is basically to just kind of provide structure and more of like a clearer workflow with how to basically work with HTML and CSS, and basically to build out, they can be used to build out static pages, but actually, the main use case for front-end frameworks is like to make your pages much more dynamic, or as people will typically say, is like they're used for web applications and not just for static pages. Oh, that's the other Sean. I think mine on Slack is lowercase s, and then there's another Sean with a capital S anyways. So I guess you're not talking to me. I should stop looking at Slack. You guys are distracting. So again, general idea of front-end frameworks is just that they provide structure and kind of a bit of a workflow. And again, there are a bunch out there, but we've decided to opt to teach you guys React for a number of reasons. First being and I'm not going to say this is like that great of a reason, but the first kind of reason is that it's very popular right now. It's being used a lot right now. There's pretty high demand for it, so it's kind of hot right now. That being said, I think actually the stronger reason for why we teach it is because I'm going to throw this term around, but I call it pedagogically sound. And basically what I mean by that is it just exposes you to a lot of kind of software design principles that you're not really going to get to see with Angular. That being said, Angular exposes you to some other principles too, like because they use TypeScript, so there's some static typing there. Anyway, so what you guys will see is that React gives you a sense of object-oriented programming, because we do stuff with components. It kind of exposes you to functional programming, which is this other paradigm. If none of those terms mean anything to you, don't worry about it. I'm just saying that React exposes a lot of these like kind of fundamental principles and makes use of them when you're working with React in a way that is we believe good for your longer term learning, right? So these kinds of principles like object-oriented programming, functional programming, these have use cases outside of just React, is kind of what I mean. So they kind of, in that sense, us teaching you React, we're getting more bang for our buck by choosing to teach you guys React versus like Angular, because, in a way we're like teaching you guys like, not teaching so much as exposing you guys to kind of more other things that, are also good for you guys to learn. And just the fact that it's really hot, it's a hot technology right now is also a feather in its cap, basically. Okay. So that being said, we're not going to get much. We just talk about the high level. So let's kind of go and look at some React code. All right. So here I'm on this kind of environment, this site called Code Sandbox IO. You can go and look at it yourself. It's basically just this sandbox. It's a code sandbox. And the name's a little misleading because this is pretty much only for like React. Well, no, it's not just for React, but it's mostly for React and some other front-end frameworks. So, but basically, it's not like you can come here and run any sort of code in their sandbox. It's mostly like front-end code. But it's nice because you have you can see all your files here, your code editor here, and then they render basically what you have in your code in this tab here. So if anyone wants to pull that up and follow along, feel free to do so. But here we have a pretty typical and extremely minimal kind of structure of a React application. So let's kind of walk through this. So first off, all the files here, so we have a package.json, which if you guys remember, I believe from JavaScript 1, you'll probably have seen a file like this inside of basically any, any library or any repository where you guys had to go and run npm install, you will have seen one of these package.json files, and basically this just lists all the dependencies and stuff. You don't really need to go messing with this, but just know that like if you clone down a repository from GitHub and you see a package.json, that's pretty much a red flag, not a red flag, but a strong indicator that you should be running npm install inside of that particular directory, right? To install your dependencies and all that good stuff. So let's first, other than that, let's start off in the other file, which you guys should have some idea of what it is. And this is this index.html. So you guys have hopefully seen a file like this before. Very typical HTML file with a header and a body, with a couple of links and stuff. Basically, none of this is all that important. The only really important thing is actually this div here with this ID. So the idea of React is it's basically going to how do I want to say this? Okay, so just out of curiosity, is possible to slide this? Sure. It just means I won't be able to answer any questions, but sure, I'll just talk. That's fine. Let me move this over a bit. Okay, so very typical HTML file here. Basically, actually, the only important thing is this div ID root, and you'll see why in a second. So now we're getting to the actual kind of React files, the files you need to work with when you start working with React. So this is kind of the index. This is like your kind of like analogous to the index.html file when you're working with HTML. You have an index.js file for kind of your React hierarchy of components and stuff like that. Okay, so what's going on here? So we see a React import at the top. You're going to see this basically for every React file. Every React file is going to have basically just this line at the top. It might take on different forms, but you're going to see React from React, for example. This is a function that I'll talk about in a second. And then we're importing a component. Don't worry if you don't know what a component is. We're going to get to that in a second. Actually, you know what? Let me just talk about real quick. Okay, actually, I just want to talk about this render function here. We're going to kind of get to this other stuff, like this stuff. This will make more sense later on, so we'll kind of talk about these concepts first, and then we'll circle back. But anyway, so render this render function call here at the very bottom. What you'll notice is the second argument being passed to this function is this document get element by ID root. And that is actually targeting this div ID root right here. Okay, so what happens is you'll basically specify all your HTML within your React files. And then at this index.js is basically the root, you know, kind of the root level HTML of within the React hierarchy. Okay, so within React, so basically think of it like this: you have your index HTML kind of at the top level. That's your highest level of HTML, and then right underneath that is everything you define inside React. Okay, and then at the top level of that React bit is the index.js. So from everything going down there is stuff for inside React that you're going to specify, and then at the root level of just the React stuff, it's basically going to take all that and append that right into your HTML via this div ID root. Okay, so this is basically where we're connecting the HTML with the React stuff. Okay. That entire connection is being facilitated by this function call here, this render call. Okay, so again, this is how that connection is made. But again, typically you won't really need to set this up because of utilities like create React app will basically spin up a minimal React app for you, and this will all kind of just be set up for you already. I'm just kind of telling you about this to fill in your knowledge gaps. But typically, this isn't really something you'll have to mess with. Like again, if you go and run some utility like create React app that will basically kind of spin up a basic React project for you, this will pretty much already be there. But again, just want you guys to know that this is kind of the bridge between what you guys were working on with just the HTML stuff and now moving into React. Is kind of how that works. Okay, so we have, so that's how that's done. And then hello.js is the other file. We're gonna talk about this separately. Okay, actually so I guess I'll periodically check Slack. I'm just not gonna leave it open. I want to see if anyone had, oh, nope. Come on. First, the root is the parent of the DOM tree, and the rest of the children. The root is the parent of the DOM tree. Yeah. If you want to think of it, I can do like an illustration to kind of think if you want to think of it one way. So, so if you think of your root level of your DOM tree, so let's say that's this node. So let's say this is this div ID root. This is the root DOM node that we had defined in that index HTML. And then later on, you're going to go and define, and then let's say this over here is your index.js. Let's just say index. I can say index.js. Okay, so this is your index.js. You have that already, and you're actually going to go and define a whole bunch of other stuff in this tree over here. This is going to be filled in with a bunch of other stuff. And then actually in index.js, you have that render function. So what that render function does is it simply creates, it has this connect. This is what connects them together. But all of your React stuff is basically going underneath the index.js file, if you want to think of it that way. But so this is kind of how that connection is made. Anyways. Right. Well, the index.js component targets the root. And then everything else is kind of built underneath index.js. You guys will get a clearer sense of that in a second. Okay, so what I typically do when I'm teaching React here, I can pass this along to you guys as well. Right, you're talking about here in this div ID root. Yeah, this can literally be called anything. You just give it an ID and then just target that here. Then you would get element by ID, whatever you called it. Root is just a convention, just because it kind of gives a little bit of a better idea of what exactly that node kind of is. If that makes sense. Okay, let me pass this along. These are the notes I'm using. So this was a repository I put together for a previous cohort, but it has a bunch of, well, this is the stuff I'm referencing as I'm walking along. So if you guys want to kind of take a look at that, let me pull it up here as well. So the way I have this set up is I walk through a bunch of these different examples, going from easier to more complex, just kind of walking you guys through one of the most fundamental abstractions of React, which will clear up a bunch of this stuff here that we haven't inside of this code sandbox that we haven't talked about yet. So let's do that. Okay, so if y'all want to follow along with that, I'm going to move this back over to the screen so I can also look at it while I have this screen open. Okay, so if we go and look at inside exercise 1 or example 1, it's called a basic component. So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to write down the same code I have inside of that basic component JS file, and I'm just going to basically talk through it. So let's do this. So new file, we're going to call it basic component.js. Okay. And if you want to open that up and look at the code in there to follow along. So, okay. So basically the fundamental abstraction, or kind of the fundamental, what's another word for abstraction? You know what, I actually don't know. So the key abstraction that React provides for you is that of a component, okay? So you're gonna hear the term React component tossed around a lot. So what exactly is a React component? A React component is basically just anything that's rendered onto a page, okay? So for example, you know, this text here, hello sandbox, you know, we can look at, I think we can go and inspect this. Right, so this is inside an h1 tag. So this could be, you know, like a component. This stuff here could be a different component. But basically just stuff that's on a screen. React is going to provide you a way to create a file that says, okay, you know, I'm going to specify some code for a component, and I want it to look like this, or I want it to have this sort of behavior. Kind of more specific, if we want like kind of a better example, if you just go to any sort of like web page, you know what, let's go to, the company site. So typically what you'll see is like, okay, you know, if we look at this page, you might see the top nav bar, for example, like this bar up here with the logo and all these different drop downs. This might be one component, okay? Because it's like a distinct thing on the page that, you know, you could think of it as its own distinct thing, right? And then within that own distinct thing, there might be other, you know, distinct things inside of it, right? So each drop down is a thing that lives inside the nav bar, but each of them on their own could also be their own like distinct component, right? With its own defined behavior, right? Because each of these, they'll drop. We can hover over them. Some of them might have a drop down, for example, right? So that's kind of like a vague notion of what a component is at the most generic level. So again, it might be nav bars, might be input fields. We want to type some input into. Any of those could be their own components. Again, React doesn't place any restrictions on how large or how small you want a component to be defined. So again, you might have one component be just a thing of a single tag of text. So for example, you could have this be its own component and this be its own component, or you could have them together be their own component if you wanted. So React doesn't place any restrictions on you as to how you kind of want to define these. It's kind of up to you and how you want to structure your application. It's kind of how you'll kind of come up with that, how you want to organize those components together, if you want, if you will. Okay. So the first rule about components is that a component needs to always render something. Right, it needs to display something. Okay, so let's showcase that with writing out our basic component. If you're following along, you can already see the code for it. But again, I'm gonna type these all out from scratch just so you guys can kind of see that. Okay, so again, we're gonna import React from React. Again, this is a React file, so you're gonna basically see that at the top. And then we're going to write this like so. Basic component is going to be a function that simply returns div hello world. So just some text. Semicolon, and then we're going to export default so that we could go and import this from somewhere else. Okay, so this is a minimal basic component. Okay, so let's use this. Okay, so we have this, we saved it, we've defined it, and now, for example, we can go inside of index.js, and we're gonna go and say import basic component from basic component. So now we're importing that. And now what we can do is we can do this. Did that not work? Hold on. Did I accidentally not close something? Nope, I closed that. For default. Did I misspell something, basically? That's not a very descriptive error message. I need to move it. Oh, it'll show up there. Why does it not show up here? Oh, no, it did show up. What? Okay, fine. Okay, so now we see here it rendered the text that we had inside the component. It rendered this div tag. Okay. Again, so this is the kind of the fundamental rule with components is that they kind of need to render something. So we can't just, not have anything here. Well, okay, what we can do is we could do just an empty div. That's fine, right? We're not saying it necessarily needs to display anything. Oh, I didn't save it. That's why. Okay, right. So we changed it. So now it's just an empty div. So this is fine. This is still considered valid, a valid use of a component, just rendering empty tags. So it doesn't actually need to specifically display anything, but it does need to quote unquote render some at least one tag. Here just being a set of div tags, and then here like we have it. We're using it, but again because it doesn't it's not displaying anything. So we're just rendering the same thing that we had before. Okay, so let's put the hello world back in. Okay. So okay, again, the different parts that we had here were our import statement, because again, we need to render React from React. We could take that out and we'd get an error. This is the definition of our component here. Again, just this is pretty much the most basic you can get, and have it still be considered a component. And again, it's like, if we just look at what the structure of this, it's nothing more than an anonymous arrow function being set to a variable name const basic component, right? So again, this here is just an arrow function that just returns this div tag. It doesn't receive any arguments. It's called basic component, and then we just go and export our basic component so that we can then, like for example, here inside of our index.js, we can go and import it and then use it. So now that we've done that, it's a little bit more clear to us now that hello here is also a component, right? So hello is a component, and you'll see that it turns out app is also a component, right? Because it's an arrow function that's returning some additional tags inside of it, like so. So it turns out app itself is also a component. It's returning this div with a bunch of nested stuff inside. And this is how you basically structure, this is basically how you'd specify the structure of your HTML, right? Just inside of the function returns, you just lay it out exactly like you would HTML to specify nesting and stuff like that. So all of that's preserved. So all that stuff that you've done, in normal HTML, that all holds true here when you're writing HTML inside of React components, right? But what's nice then is like we import our basic component and we just drop that in, wherever we want to show up, right? So for example, we could drop it here and it'll show up above the hello code sandbox, or when we moved it down to underneath it, then it showed up underneath that. And if we moved it one more time to underneath here, it'll show up over here. But you should note that I don't think we can't go and put it like out here. Okay. And the main reason is because actually each component actually needs to return a single div. You can nest stuff inside that div, but there needs to be overall there needs to be a single root level div that the component returns. So you can nest stuff inside it, which is what you basically have to do that. But inside that you can put these components in whatever order or level of nesting that you want. Okay. So again, basic component is a component. Hello is a component, and then you don't necessarily need to have everything to be a component inside of another component, right? Like this is just an h2 tag, and again, this is just a div at the root level. So not all of these are components. Some of them are just normal HTML, and then hello and basic component are actual examples of components. Okay. So that's the most basic component. I'm going to move on to example 2. So we're going to move on a little bit. And here, just go define another one. This one's going to be called a basic class component. Okay, so actually, let me just write it out first. So this is also going to have import React, of course, like normal, but it's going to be a little bit different because we're going to add something else. We're going to add these curly braces because we're going to go and import component from React. I don't know if you guys have seen this kind of structure for when you're importing, but this is called destructuring. And what it allows you to do is it kind of So it'll import this from the React library. Well, okay, it's actually easier if I just explain it like this. So we're going to define a class here. We're going to say class, basic class component. And we're going to say it extends this component that we imported up here, like so. And again, we can remove this. It's just that then here we'd have to say React.component. So, both of these will work. I just prefer doing it this way because I think it looks cleaner. But again, like if you want to do it the other way, that's totally fine as well. Both will work. But this is just kind of my preferred way to do it. And so we have to go and import it up here so that we don't have to type React.component here. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's actually saving you any keystrokes. Well, maybe a few if you really want to count it, but whatever. Okay. So here we're defining a class with the class keyword. We have the name of our component, basic class component, and then it extends off of this base component class that we're importing from React. And so the base component class is provided by React, and any class component will basically do this. Okay, so what's a class component, and why did our basic component not have this structure? Okay, so those are questions you should have in your mind right now. I'm not going to answer those just yet. Let me finish typing this out first. Okay, so we're gonna have this method called render, and it's going to return like so. And let's just have this do the exact same thing as our basic component. Okay, so this is just gonna return hello world. And then we're gonna do export default. Basic class component. Save that. Okay. So now we have these two components, basic class component and basic component, and it turns out they do exactly the same thing, right? Like we look here and it simply returns a div with hello world, which is exactly what this one also does. So if we go back to index.js, let's go and import like so, and then let's just drop it here. Now we have a second hello world. Okay. So for example, now let's go and just change this. Let's just change it to goodbye. And now you'll see an update here. But at the end of the day, both of these components are basically doing the same thing. They're returning a div tag with some text inside. Okay. So that kind of begs the question, again, why? So both are valid, obviously, because we're not getting errors. But how do we know when we want to do it this way? And by the way, this style of writing a component is called the functional style, because it's more explicit than when you look at line 3 here that this is just a function, right? It's just an anonymous arrow function. And so when you see a component written as just a function like this, it's called a functional component, okay? And then, again, class components are another way to do it. And it's pretty easy to tell because, it has the class key, it uses the class keyword, extends off component. So this is called the class component, right? Anyway, you probably could have guessed that. So it turns out, kind of the rule of thumb to keep in mind when you're thinking about whether you want to, you're defining a new component and you want to kind of figure out whether you want to do it one way or another, the functional way or the class way. It turns out if you just want to render stuff like so, the functional component is much better suited for it, right? Because we're just looking to render some stuff like we are doing here. If again, you could do it this way if you just want to render some text, some tags. You know, that's totally fine. It's just a little bit more trouble than it's worth, I guess, if you want to put it that way, right? Because you could do it this way. So the real point of class components, and which we're basically going to go talk about now, is there's additional functionality that you can do with class components. I just wanted to kind of make this transition from a basic component, this basic function component, to a basic class component, just so you know, there's much less overhead here. Like yes, there was new stuff introduced here, but it's basically just like, you know, how to wrap the exact same functionality inside of a class component from what we had as a functional component, right? So hopefully the jump from basic component to class component is not too much of a leap. Let me check if people have questions. Oh, 22 messages. Oh boy. Yes, you nest components inside of other components. That's exactly right. Does export default export the whole file or just the function? Okay. Yeah. No sibling divs. I forget off the top of my head because I feel like they did React did I feel like they did change this, but we can test that out real easily. So let's just try this. Let's see if it. Yeah, okay. Adjacent JSX elements of React. So by the way, inside of React, within the React ecosystem, anything inside here, they call it JSX. Because it's a mix of, like, you know, you have normal HTML tags, like the div tags, and then they call these, you know, JSX. This is JSX syntax. But pretty much just think of it as HTML for all intents and purposes right now. So don't worry too much about that. One sec, my dog wants to be let out of the room. All right, sorry about that. Okay. All right, cool. So let's go on to. Yeah, I think that's everything for basic class component. Okay, so I'm going to move on to example 3 now. Oh, wait, I was answering questions. That's what I was doing. Was there anything else? Can you please show index? You want to see index? Oh, what about it? Oh, just paste the link here. Export is not invoking it or anything or instantiating anything. It exports it so you can use it somewhere else. Okay, cool. So now let's move on to the next one. Okay, so now we're going to go into a little bit of some of this extra functionality that you might utilize a class component for, and that's keeping track of state. So this one's going to be called basic class component with state. Kind of a long name, but at least it's descriptive. Okay, so first off, let's copy this over. Okay, So one of the major upsides of class component. Oh, let me change this name. Okay, so one of the major upsides of using a class component is that it can keep track of some internal. It can keep track of data, some data that you maybe want to utilize, throughout the life cycle of a component. Okay. So what the heck does that mean? Okay, so let me just show you by showing you how exactly we would do that. Having some state on a component. So this is what it would look like if we just had this state object thing here. Okay, if we wanted to have something like this, we would need to have a constructor, and we need to call super. Okay, so again, constructor and super are things you should have seen from when you saw JavaScript classes. Again, shouldn't be anything new on that front with these two keywords. But then we have this dot state thing here with an empty object, right? Okay, so what is this? So basically this just allows you to keep some data within the confines of this component. And then that might be useful because we might want to render some dynamic data using whatever data is inside of this dot state. Okay. And I guess I just want to say, within this constructor that you do indeed need the call to super, because we need the call to super because without it, you're not able to call it as you don't have access to this keyword inside of the constructor. This should be not working. Let's just save. Oh, it's because I'm not. I have this defined, but it's not being used inside of index.js because I haven't imported it into there. That's why that's not showing any errors right now. Okay. But anyway, point being, you do need the super call here because we want access to this keyword inside of the constructor. So again, we're defining this dot state with just an empty object. There's nothing in there right now, of course. But what we can do with this is we can do something like, let's just say, some data 8. And then inside of the render function, we can do something like there's some data to render, and then we can use JavaScript template literals to just say this dot state dot some data. And then it will just read off of this state object and just render whatever is stored inside of that value. So being 8. So let's go import that. Okay, this should be rendering that, right? Expected token.
Sean, you spelled some data wrong.
Thanks. That'll do it. Okay, cool. Right, so now we see here's some data to render 8, and then we can just go and change this. It's like 10, and you see it'll update here. So just a simple example of using state here, but obviously this isn't actually really dynamic. But we'll get to that in a little bit. Something I did forget to mention from earlier. So you'll see that this function render here. Okay, so you only again we see it on a class component, but we don't see it on the functional component, right? And that's because with the functional component, it's basically just expected that whatever you return from the functional component is, analogous to what would go inside of the render function here. Right? So basically just a more verbose way of saying, whatever you render, the stuff inside this render function, whatever you're returning here in this return statement is, basically the same as what you'd return from the component as if it were a function, right? But we have render here, and then you also notice we have, this is also called render. So are these the same thing, right? And the answer to that is no. Again, this render function here, which receives, it is kind of similar. And you'll see that because with this render function here, it receives some component, app here, which again is its own component. So it receives a component, and then it takes that and it basically appends that to the second argument here, this document get element by ID root. Right? So it's taking the app component, whatever HTML is all inside here, and it'll basically, kind of expand. So like, for example, inside we have a basic component has its own HTML inside of it. So React under the hood will basically look at each of these components that we have defined and expand them to just be the HTML that each of these contains on their own, right? So by the time we append it all onto the index HTML file, it will just be, it would be as if you just like took all of the components and basically like unraveled them so that they're all kind of on the same level, but with the proper nesting, if that makes any sort of sense. I'm not sure that did. Okay, but again, my point being was, with this render function, this again is kind of the bridge between the root, the highest, the index.js, the root level React file with the index HTML file, right? So this render function here is how we bridge those, and I guess render probably isn't a great name for it, but that's what they chose to go with, which is probably a little confusing because, again, inside of all these class components, we also have this thing called render. So with this render, this is a method you basically need to define on every class component. So you can't have a class component without a render method, okay? And this is a method that is provided via this React component here. So that's where that's coming from. So it expects you, it gives you this template for this render function. It expects you to fill it out for every class component. So if you don't have that, it won't be a valid class component. And yes, it does always need to be called render. So you always need to name it render. So again, with any class component, whatever you want that class component to render, you need to stick that inside of the render function, on the class component. Okay. So that's where that was coming from, right? That was explaining that. Okay. And then one last thing I want to explain with this. So the next example will have us talking about how to make this a little more dynamic, using the state more dynamically. But before we get to that, I did want to also mention that with the, I think with the most recent version of React, we can actually simplify this a little bit. So now with the most recent version of React, you can do just this instead. So you can say some data, what we had 10. I think you need a semicolon there, and then, for example, we just comment this out. So now what you can actually do is you can just define state like this. So you don't need the constructor, you don't need super, you don't need this keyword. You can just type it out like this. Do you need a semicolon? Maybe not. Okay, I guess you can just do it like that. So you can just do it like this. So it is slightly cleaner, saves you a bunch of keystrokes. A couple of things to note though is that you still do need to call it inside of the render function with this. So if you take this out, this will fail. Reference error, state is not defined. So again, even if you do it like this, you need to access anything on state with this keyword. Okay, which basically implies that so the term for this is so basically what happens is you type it out like this, and then React under the hood will turn that into the old way of doing it. So inside your code, it'll basically change that to do it this way with the constructor, with the super, and then just change it to back to this, basically. It's just like a convenience for the developer that it allows you to save you a bunch of keystrokes and just do it this way. But under the hood, it'll go and basically just transform it into this again. So that's why going forward, I'm going to continue doing it like this. Instead of doing it this way. I just wanted to let you guys know that you can simplify it a bit by doing it this way. And just to throw more trivia at you, the term for having the library basically do this for you and then expand it into something else is what's called syntactic sugar. But anyway, let's not get into that. Just remember that, again, if you want to do it this way, you need to still use this keyword when you're accessing whatever's inside of state, even though we didn't prepend it here. And actually, you can't prepend that here because you won't actually, I don't think you'll have access. Yeah, you won't have access to this when you're not inside the constructor like that, like what you have here. Okay. So I'm going to comment that out and then put this one back in. Just to remind you guys, I'm going to be doing it this way, though you can do it this way. Okay. So again, that's kind of the basics of state. Again, this is kind of how you would add it into a component. We're not really doing anything with it yet. I mean, a little bit. We're just like rendering whatever is inside of it, and you can of course have a bunch of other stuff in here. It's basically because this is just an object, so you can throw a bunch of key value pairs in here, and it doesn't really restrict you on how many you want to throw in there. Okay, so I'm going to move on to exercise 4 for those of you following along. Okay. This is going to be class component updating state. Okay, so this one's going to be a bit of a jump. So again, I'm just going to start it from scratch. Component, define our class component updating state. Yes, but not between the lectures. I mean, I don't typically do that. Is that like really needed? I mean, again, this is getting recorded, so if you really want to step away, that wouldn't be the end of the world. Yeah. Okay, cool. I'm gonna do that. Class component extends component. Again, I'm gonna do stuff with the constructor, super, and we need that again because we want to access this keyword inside of the constructor. So here we're going to do a number. Let's keep it at 8. And then what we're going to do is we're going to define a couple of additional methods on our component class. So again, we can do that because this is a class. We can define additional methods on it. So here we're going to add an increment function. We're going to have it as an arrow function. It's going to look like this. So it's going to be called, it's going to look like this. Type correctly. Set state a number. Okay. It's going to look like this. Okay, so a couple of things going on here. So this is a method that we are defining on our component class. It's different from the render method because with the render method, that is provided by the component class that we were importing from via React. It's just that, so that's why you don't see the render as an arrow function. Because again, this is coming straight from the component class, but increment is not. Right, so again, we are defining this ourselves on this class, and so, and again, I do it as an arrow function because if you don't do it as an arrow function, you're gonna have to do some stuff with binding. So you know, let's just look at that. So for example, we could still do it like this. So we could have it have the same signature as render, but then if we wanted to do that, we would have to do this dot. We'd have to do something like this dot increment equals this dot increment dot bind this for this to work, because we'd have to bind this method to the component. And it turns out if you just use an arrow function, it'll do that automatically for you. So that comes for free with arrow functions. So this saves quite a bit of keystrokes, which is why I just do it this way. And it's also just it's just a better clue that, well, not better, but, it's just a clue that, this is a method that is not included, doesn't come from the component class. This is, self-defined by the user, right? If you see it as an arrow function. Okay, so and then what's going on inside the actual body of the function here? So we have this funky set state call, this dot set state. Again, this is also provided via React. This is getting imported from React. And this is basically the canonical way with which you should be updating anything in state. Okay, so you should never actually be doing something like this dot state dot a number, plus plus. You should not be doing this, okay? Never, ever, ever, okay? It technically will work because, again, this is just an object and you can just access, whatever the values inside the object like you would with any other object, but you should never do it in the context of React. They provide you this set state function for a reason. The reasons as to why they do this are, would take us, some time to explain that I don't think I really want to get into right now. So at the moment, let's just take it at, for you guys, let's just take it at my word that you want to be doing it this way. And then if you want to go look up, what sets, the reason as to why you should be using set state, you can do some research of that on your own. So anytime we want to update the state object, we use this set state function. And the way it works is, so you invoke it. So these parens on the outside invoke set state, and then you pass it another object right? Because there's the curly braces inside. And inside of this object, you just specify exactly which fields you want updated and then their updated value. So you can pass multiple things into a set state call if you want to update multiple values inside of the state object at once. But again, there's only one field here, so that's not going to be happening. So but basically what's happening here is we call set state. So every time increment gets called, it just updates state. It updates the a number field with the incremented version of the old this.state.a number field. So it increments it first and then sets that as the new value. So it turns out if you had the increment afterwards, it wouldn't actually work because it would set a number to be itself, and then at that point, it would have already performed the update, and then it would increment. But then that increment just basically gets lost, if that makes sense. So yes, you do need to have this in front so that it does the increment first and then does the update. Okay, so we have an increment. We're also going to have a decrement, which is going to look pretty much exactly the same, just with minuses instead of pluses. So we're going to update the a number field again, and we're just going to say minus minus this dot state, like so. And again, you do need semicolons for the methods that you define. If you're doing it as an arrow function, you're going to need the semicolons, I believe. We'll complain to you if you don't. Maybe it won't. Oh wait, we're not using this component yet, so it's not going to throw an error anyway. Okay, so now there's some way for us, there's some methods on our component that will actually update this state object. So now inside of our render, we can, again, render out our number. So let's have a div here. And then we're going to do another div with, let's just say our number. And then this is going to be this dot state dot a number. Close this div. And we need some way to actually invoke these functions here, or these methods here, right? So we're actually going to have a couple of buttons. So I'm going to say button. We're going to give it an onClick handler, because when the button gets clicked, we want to invoke our this dot increment. Close that. We can close that. But then we also want to give this button some text. So between the button tags, let's just put plus. So it's going to display a little plus there. And then likewise for decrement, onClick, minus button. And that's why we need these outer divs so that these won't get rendered as siblings. So I think, let's just try this. I think we tried this already, but this isn't going to work. Oh, right, it's not getting used yet. Keep forgetting that. Well, I think we tried it already. We tried rendering sibling divs in index.js, and that didn't work. So it shouldn't work here either. And then lastly, we need our export default, class component, updating state. So now we can go and include this here. Let's put this down here. Oops, forgot to import. Spelled correctly, and then let's put an updating state here. Expect oh, this is the button. Yep. Okay. Save that. Okay, cool. So now we see our number here, everything that's being rendered inside of our component, right? So we have this div tag with our number, and then these two buttons. And then we can go and click on this, and it will go and update our number. Because we click on the button, it invokes the whatever is specified inside the onClick handler. So since we clicked plus, it calls this dot increment, which will go here, invoke our increment method, which sets state, which updates the a number field by first incrementing whatever is inside this .state.a number and then setting that as the new a number value. So we just keep doing that for example, and we decrement like so. Cool. So that's so this is a pretty great example of why we might need a state object on this component, right? The component needs to keep track of what the number is if we have methods like this, right? So this is a pretty prime example of using the state object inside of a component to basically just keep track of those changes. And you can't do this with a functional component, right? Because with the functional component, it doesn't provide, it's not implemented as a class, so it doesn't give you access to be able to do something like, have an object on it, right? Because it's just a function. I mean, I suppose, no, let's see how that would work. Because again, with these functions here, like they basically just, they just return something. But I guess that does make me wonder, like, if you just defined it as a more complex function. I've never tried that though. I'm not going to start trying it now, but if anyone's curious. Okay, I think I finally get closures. That second button is fringe. Is the arrow function inside a class a React thing, or pretty much anything? It's a general thing. You can do it with any classes. And what I was saying about binding when you don't have it defined as an arrow function also holds true of just normal JavaScript classes. To start up projects before we uploaded. Oh, you're talking about the. So onClick replaces add event listener. OnClick here in this, well, okay, so OnClick is just another, it's a more specific handler. It's a more specific handler that specifically just knows to detect for clicks. It turns out you can actually, you can have an OnClick handler even on like a div, for example. Actually, let's do that just for fun. So like we could change this to a div, and I believe it would still work. Let's fix all this. Sure. So if we keep this one as a div, so we save that and refresh this. Lower this. All right, cool. So now we see that this is no longer a button. Wait, come on. So yeah, it's no longer a button per se, but you can still click on it, and it still has, so it'll adhere to slightly different rules. So for example, it's a div, so it has like a longer, I think it has like a longer, has more of a length. So you can see like I can click like over here because it's like going along the entire length of the page here. So like, yeah, I can click it over here because it's, I'm still along the same x-axis, but and that's not the case with the button here. But it does work, right? Like we can go and define an onClick on a div, and then so long as you click within that div, which goes across the length of the page, it'll still, invoke the whatever the method we're passing into the onClick handler. So again, onClick just knows to detect for clicks. I don't know, like, I don't know if this would work on like a span, maybe, but you know. Anyways, just so you guys know. Anything else? Nope, I think I talked about everything there. Just check. Can you post the code for class component updating state? Well, I mean, these are all in that link that I pasted earlier. So actually, I mean, like, you have access to all this code already. And in fact, you even have like access to the script I'm basically using. The script that I'm basically referencing, like, this is all in there. So while you will have to technically wait for the recording, like, I think you basically have the next best thing already. Anyways. So I think, you know, even without the recording, that would help you guys quite a bit when you start working on the project. Okay, we have 2 more to get through. So now that we've added methods, okay. So now the next one is going to be called class component iterating state. And this particular component is going to be, let me add all the boilerplate first. Okay, so now inside of state, we're going to add multiple fields. Okay, so we're gonna do this. So it's gonna have an ingredients field, which is gonna be an array. So it's gonna have some stuff already inside of it, and then we're gonna have a new ingredient string. So if it isn't clear what this is gonna be for, it'll be made clear a bit later on. So don't worry about it just yet. Let's add our render. And for now, let's just do we're going to render this dot state dot ingredients. So what we want to do now is we want to basically render everything inside of the ingredients array just in like a list in our component. Okay, so how would we do that? Well, basically we want to iterate, you know, through this array and put all of them inside of like a list tag or something, like an li tag or something, for example, right? So what we can actually do is we can use map, or the array map function, and we can do ingredient, and as the callback, we're going to just say ingredient, pass in function. And, you know, inside the callback function, it'll just say take an ingredient and just throw it inside of a div or an li tag. We could do that too, but I'm just gonna do it as a div here for now. Did I forget? Those all seem to line up.
Oh, you got to put a space between the class and the name, yeah.
Wait, what?
Line 3 between.
Oh, no, I got it. There we go. Okay. Thanks. So let's go here. No, let's try. Okay, not very pretty, but now you see we are rendering everything that was inside of this array here. Okay, so that's pretty cool. And again, we're doing it with an array map because again, this .state.ingredients is just a normal array, so we can utilize any of the array methods that we learned about in the JavaScript material. So we can use map, we could use for each, we could use any of those any of that stuff is all applicable here. Map is just the most appropriate here because here we want to go and basically just I won't say this. So basically what we want to do, right, is so let's comment this out. No, it doesn't work. By the way, comment if you want to comment out some stuff inside of the HTML, you have to go do it this way. So it's different comment syntax. Okay, so now that's commented out. But basically what's happening here is we want to do something like this .state.ingredients 0, right? So that would display flour, this .state.ingredients 1, so on and so, it doesn't even format it correctly. Well, so on and so forth, okay? And actually, it turns out the map call basically will just do that for us. Because again, with map, we're iterating through our array, our ingredients array, and creating a new array, right? Because again, if you remember, map returns a new array based on the callback. So it's actually returning a new array where it takes each ingredient and just puts them inside of a div. So then you can imagine that we have the result of the map call will replace this line here with all of the ingredients inside of a div tag. Oh, that's what I was missing. So I had this. So I think if we wanted to do that, that would work or not. Why is that not working? Yeah, okay. So that'll format it correctly. But this is basically what our map call, this .states.ingredients.map is already doing for us in one line. Because then we'd have to spell this out, and that wouldn't be dynamic because then we'd have to go and change our code every time like a new ingredient was added or removed from our list. Like we'd have to go and change this. We'd have to be like, oh, we don't want, there's no ingredient at X index anymore. We have to go and change our code and remove that, right? So instead, this map call will just handle that for us, which is pretty sweet. But that's basically what it's doing underneath, underneath the magic that map is. Okay, so we have an ingredient list. What do we want to be able to add stuff to this ingredient list? Well, okay, we can add a form to do that. So let's go and add a form tag, and it's going to have an onSubmit function, and it's going to, let's say, be called this.add ingredient. We haven't defined that yet, but we will. So let's just say it has an add ingredient. close that form there. Inside this form, we're going to also add an input because you need to be able to type new ingredients into an input field. So it'll be type text on change. Let's just say call it this dot handle ingredient input. And again, we haven't defined that yet, but we will. Let's give it a placeholder with add a new ingredient. Close that input tag. I think that should be, oh, and then one more. I need to say, let's do this. So let's go and indent all these like so. So it's a bit easier to read. Okay, and then one more, we need to give it a value, and we're going to have it as this dot state dot new ingredient. So this is actually going to read off of this new ingredient field, and that's where the input field is going to get its value, or whatever is inside of the input box. Okay, and right now that's just an empty string. So basically, we need some way to go and update this string, this new ingredient value. And if it turns out it's going to be whatever is in this onChange, this handle ingredient input. So let's define that function. So we're going to have handle ingredient input to be an arrow function, so we don't have to do the binding ourselves. And this will be, so what the idea here is when this is going to get invoked anytime there's any change in the input box, because we're doing this inside of an onChange handler, right? So anytime, you know, the user will click on the input box and then they'll type in some text, all of that, every time that happens, that will invoke this onChange handler. So basically what we want our onChange handler to do is, you know, get the value from the input box and basically update this new ingredient string, right? So for that to happen, we're going to say this dot set state. Oh, and then actually, this particular method is going to receive the event object from the browser API, and that comes through the onChange. So anytime the onChange gets invoked, we're going to say, you know, inside the browser API, there's an event object. So we're going to say anytime onChange is invoked, pass that into this handle ingredient input method. So this function is going to receive that, and we need this because inside of the event object is how we will actually go and fetch the value of whatever the user typed into the input box. So then the way this will look is this dot set state new ingredient is going to be event.target.value. So this is fetching the value from this input box. So it's taking that, and then we're updating our new ingredient string with that value. So this is getting the entire piece of text that is inside of the input box. Right? So we're fetching that and then updating this new ingredient string with that. And again, that's going to happen every time the user types into the input box. So anytime any sort of change happens, they could delete text too, right? So anytime they edit any of the text inside of that input box, that will invoke this handle ingredient input method. And then we also need to add ingredient. It turns out this add ingredient function is actually going to receive the same event object, but for a very different reason. Okay, so event here is going to be, so again, event is an object, so it has both values and it also has functions inside of it that we can invoke. And one of these is actually called prevent default. I don't know if you guys have seen this one. So we're going to invoke it like this. And basically what this does is, well, so with the form, anytime we go and submit a form, part of the default behavior in some browsers when you submit a form is it will actually go and refresh the entire page, which we don't want because that will then reset the state of our component back to what we initially defined it as just this, which means we're going to lose any progress we had from when we updated our form. So we want to prevent that. We want to prevent that default behavior on the form and just say, we just want the form to do this specific stuff that we're going to specify inside of this add ingredient method when we go and call the submit handler. Does that make sense? And we'll show that in a second. So maybe later on, I'll just go and remove this and we'll see what happens when we go and submit the form. Okay, but anyways, questions. Oh yeah. Will then add an ingredient for each character. Well, okay, so you'll type in a new character, right? And that will just the input box will have the entire string. So actually, what you get from event target value is just the entire string, not just the new letter or not just the new character that was inputted. It gets the entire string, and then we just set that entire string as the new ingredient string. Okay. Okay. So for add ingredient event, okay, we're going to define another array. It's going to be called ingredients list, and this is actually just going to be a copy of this .state.ingredients, like so. We're going to need this because we're going to go and update. So we're going to do ingredients list dot push this dot state dot new ingredient, and then we're going to call this dot set state with ingredients to be ingredients list, like so. And then secondly, we're also going to do new ingredient is going to be an empty string again. Okay, so so everything up here is all basically serves the point of updating our ingredients list. So you'll see we're doing it a little strangely because we make a copy of our ingredients list array. So ingredients list is just a copy of this .state.ingredients. We push onto the copy. We don't push onto the original. We don't push straight onto this .state.ingredients, right? Because we have mentioned that we should not ever be accessing this .state, any values on this .state directly. So we should never do something like just straight say this .state.ingredients .push this .state.new ingredient, right? So we're not allowed to do that. So then the way we're gonna get around that, even though it isn't as efficient, to be honest, but this is something that React prescribes that you do, actually. So it's something that the React developers, like the people who develop React, intend for you to do it this way, is not to actually mutate the actual array, the actual array in state directly, right? So another way to get by that is to make a copy, push onto the copy, and then say set new ingredients to be ingredients, like so. We update the field so that it's set now to the new ingredients list, which is the same as the old ingredients list, just added. We added the new ingredient string that the user typed in, right? And then we reset new ingredient to be an empty string again. And we need to do that because once we have updated, like up to here, we've updated the array now with, so the array will have the new string that the user inputted. And now we want to be able to accept new input, so we need to go and clear the new ingredient field. So that's empty again so that the user can then type in more stuff. Because if we didn't do this, then it would still have the value of the old text that the user just entered into the form, And so now that would be in both the array as well as the input field, and we don't want that. So we need to go and clear it out, right? Console. Just recent 0.24. It seems fine to me. Well, we'll see, I guess. Line 21 is not mutating the. No, it's not mutating the array. It's just saying this dot state dot ingredients set the value of this key to now be ingredients list. So no, we're not mutating whatever is stored there. We're just discarding its old value and giving it a new one, right? So that's not actually mutating the old value. Right. It's the functional way of doing things, not to mutate the existing data. Is there a reason you cleared if you added the update array? Oh, no, not particularly. You can do it in the other. Yeah, you can do it in the other order. It doesn't matter. Target value is, again, just whatever is inside of the input box. Inside whatever you type into this input box will be stored inside of event.target.value. That's just how you access that. Yeah, it'll work either way. Again, event target value just stores the value of whatever is inside this input box. And so we grab that by accessing event target value, and then we set new ingredient to be that string, that value. So let's save that. I think this is already getting, yeah, this is already getting used. So now we can do, I don't know, buttermilk. We hit enter, and now we have added it to our array, to our ingredients array. So that's pretty cool. So now we're updating state with some user input. All right, I wanted to see what happened when we go and comment that out. So, oh, and then so you'll see we changed the code, which actually refreshed the page as well. So anytime you go and edit the code inside of a React component, you see it automatically went and refreshed the application state, all of it, right? So like this went back to just being this array. And if this array was empty, then there would be nothing in here, right? So this is just the initial values that we have basically just hard coded into the component. So we're going to add buttermilk again. Let's just add butter, right? So we added butter, and then because we didn't have event.prevent default, it triggered the default behavior of the form, and you saw that it went and refreshed. So that's exactly why event prevent default is called here, to prevent that on submit refresh behavior. Because we typed in butter, we hit enter, and you saw for a split second there that it did go and update the component. It did update, it did get added to the list, but then the browser refreshed, and then we basically lost it, right? So that's why that's there. Was there other stuff I said I would talk about? Oh yeah, another thing I wanted to talk about was why is that the browser's default setting? I don't know. Do you know how we can look at the browser default? No, I don't. I do want to talk about one more thing since we have like 10 minutes left till lunch. So another way you could go and do the updating is if you want to be a little more slick about it, actually. So we can do something like this. I think it'll look like state dot. Okay, let me check that this works. I think it does. I think this works fine. Yeah, okay, so this will work too. Okay, so if you haven't seen the spread operator, well, that's basically what's going on here. So, and actually this isn't, well, okay, it is slightly different from what we were doing here, where we explicitly made a new copy. So what's going on here is we're saying inside of set state ingredients, set it to a new array, right? So we have array brackets. So this is indicating we're making a new array. And the way we're making that new array is we're using what's called the spread operator. And basically what this does, it just looks at all of the elements inside of this .state.new ingredients and just copies them straight into this new array we're creating. Okay, and then at the end of it, we also specify inside of this array, we also want this .state.new ingredient, right? So now we've basically created a new array that had all the contents inside of this .state.ingredients, the old array, now with the new ingredient added, because we have it appended at the end here like so. Actually, I want to also, what happens if we remove this and put it in the front? So I think you can do this as well, and actually it will add it to the, yeah, it'll add it to the top now. So you see, like, again, we're just creating a new array and using, again, the spread operator to copy everything that was inside the contents of this .state.ingredients. So again, this just enumerates through, like iterates through them and just copies them. So you can imagine that this gets basically just replaced with all of the array elements inside of this .state.ingredients. And then we also specify, we also want this .state.new ingredient to also be in this new array like so. Just because I think it's slightly better, we're going to go and add this .state.new ingredient at the end, not the front. So this is another way to do it, if this makes sense to you. If not, you can just do it. You can do it this way as well. If this is a little bit more, I would definitely say this way is definitely more, explicit, because we're explicitly making a copy of this .state.ingredients, storing that in a new variable, pushing onto it, and then setting that to be the value of this .state.ingredients. So here, let me comment that out. Let's put this back in. Like so. Okay. So I'm going to go and comment out the less explicit way of doing it, but just know that this is another valid way of doing it. And this is actually once you get more experience with React, it turns out this is the way you'll see most other developers write. This is the pattern you'll see more often when you look at like React code out in production or in the wild, for example, just because it's like slicker, and we all know developers love slicker ways of doing things, right? Yep. Yep. I don't understand the, oh, okay. Okay, I guess You got that part? Okay. That's pretty much all the examples that I have here, and that's pretty much I think everything you'll need to tackle the sprint. Unless people still had more questions. About another 5 minutes till lunch if you guys want to take that time. Well, I'm glad you guys liked it. Quick question still, can you use the modern way of handling events? Is that the modern way? I mean, I suppose you could add like an add event listener on like, then you'd have to specify click, right? Or on change inside of input and anywhere else you wanted an event listener. It has to be added in a different file affecting components. I guess I don't actually know off the top of my head. If you want to try to experiment with that, you're freely able to do that. But I mean, at the same time, I feel like, isn't this just easier? Just specifying, say, whenever there's a change, I just want it to invoke some method, or whenever on submit, I want to invoke this method, or on click, I want to invoke this method. Like, I don't know. Isn't that easier? Yes. So I guess you could. There probably is a way to do it the other way. Can you explain target? Again, it's just a way to go and fetch whatever's inside of this input box. So sure, let's do this. So let's say we're going to console log target dot event dot target dot value. Inside the console. So now, come on. So now we'll go and type butter inside, and you'll see event.target.value basically gets the value of whatever is in the input box at any point in time, at after some action, right? So first I typed in B and then U, and it just gives you the whole thing BU and then BUT, and it just so it builds up the value of whatever's in here. And if I go and delete R, then now we have this. Go and delete again, and now it's that. Let's change that real quick. So on and so forth. So we're literally just using event target value, and this is just how you access this particular piece of data from the input box. So we're just grabbing that and we're just updating. So every time this changes, new ingredient is changed to match it, basically. So new ingredient also just holds whatever text is inside of this input box at any point in time whenever it changes, right? So now we submitted, and now this is empty again. Now we can hit another letter A, and now it gets that, right? Now it's empty because we deleted. So that's just how you access that. Spread operator is like a secret agent. Okay. Just to confirm, line 25 using bracket notation to reassign the value associated with the ingredients key. I guess the spread operator can depend as many parameters, whether arrays or values in between the brackets. And to flatten, yes, that's pretty good summary. Yeah, again, those brackets just kind of signify we're defining a new array. We're used to site-wide changes on components. You're used to site-wide changes on components. Okay, if that's the case, you're gonna wanna kind of invert that level of thinking again, because with React components, you wanna think of each component as being very like kind of isolated, right? It's its own distinct thing that, you know, will kind of handle whatever changes it needs in order for it to run on its own, kind of like within its own confines, right? So you're not really gonna see stuff like, yeah, you're not really gonna see, you know, code or changes that kind of affect all components at once. It's kind of like, you know, each component like takes care of itself, or is a little more self-sufficient in that sense. Set state is part of React. Yes, set state is part of React. Is using that new ingredient string preferred over just adding the value of the input on submit. Oh, I see. So what you're saying is, okay. I'm just figuring out how to answer that particular question. Okay, so maybe what people were a little hung up about with event target value. So event target value, the reason it fetches the value from the input is because of this line here. Because you'll note that we have value set to the state new ingredient. So you'll note there's a bit of like a circular kind of relationship going on here, right? So we'll type something in to the input box. That will go and update the value inside of this input here. Well, no, we'll type something in that'll invoke this change. So that'll actually invoke, so we type something in that will invoke this change. Wait. Okay, actually, how does the ordering of this work? So you type something in, and I think it makes more sense if this is where the change happens first. Actually, I'm not sure. I can see arguments for like being. So what I'm not sure about right now is we type into the input box. I don't know whether it gets to like this value here gets updated first, and then we invoke handle ingredient input, which then event target value here grabs this value and then updates it. I guess. Yeah, I guess that makes more sense than doing it the other way around. Like instead typing a value in first, and then this gets invoked. This handle ingredient input gets invoked first because it can't grab value if value hasn't been updated yet, if that makes sense. So value needs to be updated first, and then we grab it inside of handle ingredient input to update the new ingredient string. But at the same time, the new ingredient string is the value that's going to be inside of this value, inside the input value. So yeah, this is a weird kind of like circular relationship going on here. Okay, sure. You know what? Let's try that. So you were saying, okay, you were saying push. In which case you're saying we don't need this. Okay, so that doesn't seem to work. Why does that not work? Because I'm hitting enter and it just doesn't go through. Do this back, even though we're not using it. Why is it? The ingredient is not defined. What are you talking about? Ingredients list. Just being silly. Let's see. So if we console log here event target value, console there. Okay, somehow event target value, this doesn't get updated here. Or wait, no, what am I talking about? I haven't tried to. Okay. So I console logged event target value here upon add ingredient. At this point, it's null. So we're not pushing anything to the ingredients list. So as to why that's happening, I'm not entirely sure. But I guess that's maybe a reason as to why you do need to do it this way. Yeah, for some reason, event target value here. Let me put that back. And then put this back to ingredients. Yeah, for whatever reason inside of this function, it's always null. So you can't push that. You can't update the state with it. So that's why it has to be done this way, by updating this string inside of state. Oh, I see. On submit is, yeah, pressing enter, or you could also define a button to perform the submit. Comment out on change. Comment that out. Can we just do... Oh, it doesn't like that. Just have to remove that. Okay, so remove that. Let's just keep this in here. If you don't have the on change, that's fine. Okay, if you don't have the on change, you can't even update this now, input now. Because now we have, okay, well, what if we try getting rid, because of this, so you don't have an on change that now allows you to change the this.state.ingredient string. So now this is always set as an empty string. So now whenever you type into this, nothing's gonna happen. If we remove this. Okay, so we can type into this, but it's still null here when we submit. So nothing's getting pushed onto the ingredients list in this case either. I think you're going to get the sprint. You're going to get the sprint. I don't think we're going to zoom after lunch. Add ingredient doesn't know about the events. The event called the handle function. Probably something like that. The value of the form is null, but you're not passing in names to the form. So the form needs names to access values. Okay, well, I've showed you a way that works. So if you want to try to figure out another way that also works, that's cool too. But you know one way that works, even if perhaps it's not as ideal as you would like. Okay, cool. Sorry I've run into your lunch a bit. I tend to do that. Anyways, cool. So I will post the link. Actually, let me just do that right now. So I'm going to post the link here. Try to get set up with it as best you can with like npm installing React and stuff like that. Oh, and that should be, no, you shouldn't have to do that. Well, node and npm, which hopefully you all already have, but yeah, if you run into setup issues, definitely notify the help channel, and I or TA will try to help you get sorted out. But basically, in this, you're going to be implementing a little. This is basically, it's like a to-do application. Just read through the README, and you'll hopefully understand. And I gave you the link to all this code that I was basically referencing to go through all of these examples. So you still have access to that. You can feel free to reference that. But yeah, okay. I will not cut into your lunch hour anymore. So that's it for me. And yeah, I'll talk to you guys later. I think a TA will, if a TA was, I think they figured out the pairing. So if they want to let you guys know what those are, I think they can do that pretty soon. But yeah, just go and take your lunch hour, and I guess it's fine if you guys want to, get back by like 12:15. That's totally fine. But yeah, anyways, I'll talk to you guys later.